In Hebrews chapter 1. I'm going to prove right now it's not the Father in verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, verse 9, verse 10, verse 11, or verse 12. He does speak in verses 5 and 13. The reason he speaks in those verses and not the other verses, I'm going to make plain to you from the text of Hebrews chapter 1 and reference the context of each quotation. And then you're going to see very clearly why in verse 5 and in verse 13, it is the Father speaking. Because it's the Father speaking in those two original contexts from which verses 5 and 13 quote. The reason the Father is not speaking in verses 6 through 12, as I'm going to show from Hebrews chapter 1 in a moment, also relates to the fact none of those contexts or those quotations, verses 6 through 12 of Hebrews 1, have the Father speaking. Let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to start in verse 5 because that's where these quotations begin. I released a video yesterday responding to God Logic's abuse of Hebrews chapter 1, which is similar to Sam Shamoun's abuse of Hebrews 1 and many other Trinitarians. My friends, this is not a minor deal. Okay? We all know Sam is a blasphemer and a pig, and he regularly defames the God of the Bible, the Messiah of the Bible, the Holy Spirit of the Bible, the Christians of the Bible, and the Bible. God Logic is his protégé. He's following in his footsteps. Don't look at his face. He looks a lot nicer than Sam. If you do that, then you shouldn't be in this discussion. Does Jah take faces and make his decisions based on that? Sometimes it's a little hard for us. Don't do that. When you have so much evidence in front of us showing God Logic is no different from Sam. He supports Sam. He's with Sam. He is effectively Sam. So you can see that Sam's blasphemies and perversions of these scriptures are propagating, right? He's multiplying, right? He's going to try to spread his perversion as much as he can. Now, it's very strange, of course, because some of his arguments are the things he's most known for recently, like the Father praying to the Son in Hebrews 1, which does not happen and is blasphemy. People like God Logic and others don't understand either, right? They're repeating these very same horrific blasphemies. No matter what evidence you show them, they don't care. They're not interested in what the Bible actually teaches. Now, they'll say they are, but just look at what they said. Look at what he did yesterday. Barely read half, if that, of Hebrews 1, right? Skip past all the stuff that was so obvious, devastated his position. That's what they do. They're not honest people. You have to stop thinking of these kind of people who are up here all the time, lying to tens of thousands, hundreds. Why are you taking it soft on these guys? It would be better to go more aggressive than less, because these are perverts. These are not good. No one is good, especially not people who are with Sam Shamoun teaching blasphemies. Okay? You need to remind yourself of that, or you're going to be susceptible to their other perverted tactics, which try to make them seem like a victim. All the while, both of these two and all of their other associates, many of them, attack and defame people, their mothers, their religion, their God, our religion, our God, our Messiah. Why are you taking it easy on these people? I have to tell myself that. Now I'm asking you that because I want you to think about that and answer just why. Again, there's no reason. When they play the victim, that's just the emperor. playing the victim so he doesn't get killed by Mace Windu. And he gets people who only see the face, taker of faces, right? You're not looking past what the evil person is doing, what works on people. You have to think beyond basic attacks. Okay, these people are very serious and they are very committed to the spread of this fake God and this false religion, this perversion of Christianity that has been damaging people and confusing people for almost 2,000 years. Okay, this is sick and disgusting. Now, let me show you even more of why I say that. And there's every reason to say that. And if you don't think they say that about you and me and our Bible and our beliefs, yes, they do. And even worse. Okay? So, and if they had the chance, they would do worse. Now, let me bring up the section of text that I believe will make clear there are only 2 verses in Hebrews chapter 1 where the Father is speaking, because that's what the context of the quotations have him doing. What happens, it seems, is, at least maybe initially for some honest-hearted Trinitarians perhaps, even though this is beyond gone, right? Nevertheless, they see verse 5. Verse 5, as I'm going to show you, is where the quotations begin. And it begins with a quotation of the Father from the decree that David's reading from in Psalm 2, and also as he's speaking to David about Solomon in 2 Samuel 17:14. So, that's why he's talking. But that's not the case in the rest of the verses. What happens, though, is these guys, maybe initially some of them innocently, but otherwise what happens is they believe that just because the Father is talking in the first quotation, I guess, right, that he has to be speaking in all the others. I'm going to show you that's not true. I've done this before. I did a video, a full response to Sam. I still have it, but the audio came out really low. So I did upload it at one time a couple of years ago when we did a kind of our first really serious go around with Sam. There have been more than one, at least even recently on YouTube. So that video really thoroughly exposed another video he did. It was like a point-by-point refutation. I played him, let him expose himself, and we went to the text and showed no, everything he said was wrong. But I think I can do it quicker here, and we don't have to listen to Sam or even God Logic. We heard God Logic yesterday from the video I put up that he definitely believes, like Sam, the Father is talking, praying to the Son even, in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 through 12, and speaking to the Son elsewhere in Hebrews 1, as we'll discuss. So it's not hard to find confirmation of that. We don't need to hear it again from them. Just know this is something they both believe and teach regularly, and came up also in this video I put up yesterday. That's a part of this whole discussion of Hebrews 1 and related texts. So here is Hebrews 1:5 to begin with. You can see right here, I've clipped this all from the Bible Hub so that we can just go linearly, scroll down, linear downward, right? So vertical, descending. Hebrews 1:5, Apin, did he say? And this is, the blue part is what he says, right? So I clipped, if it has it, the speech verb that introduces the quotation, or whatever other it is that is provided. It's not always a speech verb. It's often just understood. That's how Greek is. We've discussed this before with other texts in Hebrews 1 involving poios, implied use after its initial explicit use, and also with 1 Corinthians 15:45. So this is just how Greek works many times, where it won't always repeat the same verb that's already been stated, but it's implied or understood in association with the series of things that would be also appropriately quoted by that same verb. Right? So here, right, we have, he say. He said, you are my son. That's a partial quotation from, I'm not quoting the whole thing, it's not necessary for this point, Psalm 2. Or again, quoting 2 Samuel 7, I will be his father. Okay, so the reason why we don't have to quote anything more is it's very clear, is it not? In Hebrews 1:5, like I have in the red part below, this is David reading God's decree to him in Psalm 2, and God speaking to David about Solomon in 2 Samuel 7:14. These are the only times in these quotes God is speaking until verse 13, like I said earlier. So if you disagree with me that this is the Father speaking based on the quotation of him speaking, and even in Psalm 2, it's a quotation there, so it's a quotation of a quotation here, it's still quoting God speaking though. Okay, so verse 5 to me is, there's no issue here. Everybody agrees this is God being quoted, speaking to David in Psalm 2, and then to David about Solomon in 2 Samuel. And then it's applied here to Jesus at his resurrection when he became better than the angels, like I talked about in my video yesterday. Hebrews 1:6, lege. He says, let all God's angels worship him. Okay, this is not God talking. No. It just says he says. Okay, that does not mean it has to be the same person who was speaking from in the prior quotation or quoted in the prior quotation as speaking. They're just assuming that. I'm going to show it's definitely not the case in all these verses, but it's also definitely not the case here. These are the words of a human psalmist who speaks of his and he from Psalm 97 in verses 6, 10, and 12, and your and you in Psalm 97 verses 8, 9, and 12 with reference to God. You understand? So this is not God talking in this psalm where it says, let all God's angels worship him in the Greek version that he's quoting. No, it's a psalm. It's a human writer who is speaking about in the psalm God and prophetically about the Messiah and applied in Hebrews 1 to the Messiah, right? Just like in verse 5, that quotation from Psalm 2 is applied to David. Quotation from 2 Samuel 7:14 is applied to Solomon. That's the same pattern we have all throughout this chapter. The Trinitarians are they're liars many times because they're not this stupid, right? Or they are. And me calling them stupid is the right thing, and I believe it is, okay? The Bible calls people who don't listen and repeat nonsense and lies stupid. Okay, so we know verse 5 is a quotation of the Father. That's why he's talking. In verse 6, it's quoting the psalmist who's indirectly referring to God in the third person in verses 6, 10, and 12 from this same song, right before and after the quotation in verse 7. And in the second person, your and you in verses 8, 9, and 12. When he's talking about God, it's not God talking, you understand? So you would have God then talking about God using third and second person references, right? And even in the quotation, the psalmist is speaking, he's referring to God's angels. You understand? So he's again referring to God. He's not God talking, and he's asking for God's angels to worship him in the Greek version. So God is not talking in verse 6. It's so obvious. He's not talking at all in Psalm 97 either. No, and the quotation makes it clear. It's a part of the quotation from verse 7 that makes it clear the speaker is speaking about God, about his angels. You see? Otherwise, if he was actually speaking, he'd just say, my angels, right? So that's what would indicate speech, not a third person and a second person repeated multiple times in the immediate context around that verse, which itself indirectly refers to God, not God speaking himself. Verse 6 is not God talking, not in the original verse and not here. Doesn't even make sense. Once again, it's still an indirect reference to God. It's not even made to be God talking. If the author of Hebrews wanted to change it to mean that, he could have just borrowed the language about the angels worshiping him and then said, if you claim he's quoting God here, let my angels worship him. He could have just easily made that clear and not made the context of the actual quoted psalm the same as here, which is what he does. Verse 7. Verse 7 is really like the most obvious destruction of this pagan, blasphemous heresy that every one of you must destroy. You must never, ever allow this perversion of these texts, or that the Father prays to the Son because of these perverts, right? These spiritual fags. Don't you ever allow them to get away with this. This is horrific. It's blasphemy. And I don't really care what anybody thinks. I'm not here for them. Neither are you. We're here for the one they're blaspheming. You understand? Good. Hebrews 1:7, and toward or to, he says, I just kind of clipped it so it gave the most concise elements that would introduce the quotation so that we can see what's happening, right? So that from verse 6, he says, quotation, verse 7, and to, he says, he makes his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. Okay, so do you see that again? Look, I gave you the verses there where they're in the surrounding context of verse 7 from the quotation of Psalm 97 and verse 6. Look right here. This is a quotation from Psalm 104, as you see from the red. It's a song to Ja'ol. It's not the words of the Father. It's the words of the psalmist referring to the Father, God. That's who God is, right? He's not referring to a person of the Trinity or nothing like that. He, not me, not I. He makes his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. We've been talking about this a lot recently. We're focused here on the fact that this is not God talking. Does anybody in their right mind, and I really want to know, right? It's maybe God Logic or Sam, right? But they're not in their right mind. So verse 7, lege. Okay, these are all related verbs of speech. Apen, lege, lege. Okay, this is clearly not the Father talking, is it? No, when it says he says, that's not the Father talking, is it? No, there's no way, right? Because the Father isn't talking in Psalm 104 in this quotation, and he's not talking here either. It's the exact same thing. It's quoted in the same way, unlike, of course, verses 10 through 12, but we'll get to that in relation to the Greek. It doesn't change anything in terms of the speech. But look, very clear here. Just like in the original Psalm 104, from which this quote comes, God is not talking. Okay, so we've already shown very clearly he is talking in verse 5. No one disputes that. This is where it begins. It begins with a quotation, part from Psalm 2, part from 2 Samuel 7. And in both of those, it is God the Father talking. So in the quotation, he's also talking. And there's nothing to say that's not the case. Verse 6, it's a quotation, uses lege from Psalm 97, which is not God talking in any of it. It's a human psalmist who is speaking about God indirectly in the third and second person, all over the place. Verse 6, verse 10, verse 12, verse 8, verse 9, verse 12. Okay, verse 7 is the quote. Okay, so God is not talking in verse 6, even though we have leg A connecting it from verse 5. Verse 7, we once again have leg A connecting it from the preceding verse. It's not God talking, is it? Really obvious, both from the psalm it's quoting, Psalm 104, and right here in its application. Sorry, we could just stop right here, right? Why would we ever want to do that? Verse 8 and 9, they go together. Once the quote is introduced, it just keeps going. So we're going to look at the introduction and then the elements that would tell us who's talking. You can see right here, proste ton huion, unto the Son, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. That's the translation. I don't agree with that translation, but it doesn't matter for this purpose. You want to know more about my view on how this should be translated, God is your throne or something similar? It's not evocative. No evidence for that. And there's evidence of other ways to translate it based on similar constructions in the context of Psalm 45. I have a video on it, my translations issues playlist, and I also talked a little bit about it in my video yesterday, link below. Okay, but let's ignore that for now. It actually works against Trinitarians, right? Because if it's God talking, well, they say, is where they go crazy. It's where they lose it though, right? They say that it is God talking, but he's talking to the Son as God, right? Because they're gone. So no, in the original Psalm, as I showed in my 6-hour plus video, Total Destruction of God Logic, which I'll clip from and make a separate video about this Psalm 45 issue. No, the original Psalm 45 clearly is referring to a human king. There's no question about it. You would have to be a blasphemous liar or a stupid pig not to see that. And if you're that stupid, you shouldn't be up here misleading tens of thousands of people. You should shut your mouth until you figure out how to read. All right. So, however, it doesn't have a speech verb here. It's implied, like I was talking about earlier. Okay, so far, in verse 5, we did have a speech verb, apen, lege. These are all related to the same verb, though. Lego. Lege, okay. Verse 5, 6, 7, they all have speech verbs, but they don't all mean the same person is speaking. We've shown that. We showed clearly the Father is speaking in verse 5, because that's what the quotation is doing. Then in verse 6, even though there's no break, no indicator, it's quoting though. That's your break and indicator, right? So, and plus the author of Hebrews hope probably no one would be a reject reading this. Either way, it's very clear. Verse 6 is not the Father talking, not in the original Psalm and not in the quotation of it in Hebrews 1. Then we had verse 7, same thing, right? We have the same speech verb as in verse 6. And all related to the same verb from verse 5, very clearly in the original quotation of Psalm 104, and right here in verse 7 of Hebrews 1, God is not talking. So we get to verse 8 and 9. The speech verb isn't repeated, it's implied. It's what he's doing, right? We can all see that. And so we have a series of connected quotations with implied speech verbs. So we have legitimately the quotation. The translation is disputed, so we're not going to deal with that. I've already dealt with it, so we'll deal with it when someone deals with what I've done. What I want to point out here, though, is the Father is not talking. He's not talking in the original Psalm. I proved that in my 6-hour and in my shorter clip yesterday on God Logic's abuse of this text from Psalm 45 and here. So there's no question. It's referring to him as the most beautiful among men, humans. It talks about how his sons would replace their sons would replace their fathers and be spread throughout the land as princes. It was fulfilled in terms of the worship of 1 Chronicles 29:20 for Solomon, which is what it's about. It's a wedding song, right? It's crazy stuff, the way these guys think, but they're so desperate to try to get us not to think about what it's really saying. Because remember, they don't believe the Old Testament, not really. Right? They believe in this Middle Platonism and everything that they use to reinterpret the Bible, and then their later perverted permutations of that. Okay, but look, so these are the words of the psalmist to the king at a wedding psalm in Psalm 45. So I made that clear yesterday. I don't want to have to go over it again. There's no need to. It's obvious. So at best, we'll say this is ambiguous, okay? Because Psalm 45 is talking to a human king. The translation is not our question here. The translation is, who's talking in Psalm 45? It says it's a wedding psalm. Let's actually go to that real quickly, just to make it very clear, right? I don't want to have any lingering question. This is clear, everybody. You should have no question or hesitation about what to do when these liars come to you or are deceiving people and going insane like they often do. Look, right? This is not disputable. For the director of music, to the tune of lilies, of the sons of Korah, a maskil, a wedding song. It's a wedding song. Okay, this is a human speaking to God. I'm sorry, to the king, right? My heart is stirred, a noble theme as I recite my verses for the king. We're just looking at the parts that had God in it, so my bad. What I'm pointing out here is this isn't a question of who it's talking about when we get to Hebrews 1. You know, when we're talking about as we are, who's talking in verse 8? Thy throne, O God, or God is your throne. Well, here's where it's from, right? Psalm 45. Okay. So we're not talking about in this video who this psalm is addressing, right? Is it Jesus as God, or is it a human king here in this verse? What I'm pointing out here is the one doing the addressing, the one singing the song, right, is a human. It's a human whose heart is stirred to write verses for the king, even if you think it's God, even if you think the psalmist is writing about God and not a human king. It doesn't matter in this case because we're talking about who's speaking. So this is a human singing a psalm to a king. We just read it. It doesn't matter if you think it's God. We're talking about who's talking. We've talked about who he's addressing in other videos, and it just said the king. And he goes on to describe him in human ways, right? Thou art fairer than the children of men. Grace is poured into thy lips. Therefore, God hath blessed thee forever. We didn't really get into this yesterday or in my 6-hour video that was a clip from. But look at verse 3 of Psalm 45. The psalmist, the one who's doing the singing, which is what we're talking about, right? That's who's talking in Hebrews 1:8 and in the quotation of it here from Psalm 45. So his heart is stirred. He's going to sing a song to the king. He's the fairest of men. But look at the end of verse 2. Therefore, God hath blessed thee. Look, let's go to the Hebrew. We didn't really focus on this when I was like pounding God logic and showing he was completely insane in the things he was saying. He missed, of course, reference Lord as well. But let's just focus here. Look. It says, Elohim has blessed you. This is the psalmist, right? This is the one speaking throughout Psalm 45, who says either thy throne, O God, or God is your throne. It's a human song writer. He was writing it with his pen, he said. Right here. He's speaking in verse 2 about the king he's singing to and referencing God indirectly, saying, God blessed you, the king. You understand? So we have, as we know from verse 9 and the quotation of that here from Psalm 45, that is why God, your God, or the God of you, right? But verse 2 also shows he's not addressing this psalm to God. God has blessed the one he's singing to or writing the psalm for. The king. We read that in verse 1. So very clearly, and from, of course, verse 6 and 7 and quotation in verse 9 of Hebrews 1, this is not God being addressed. It's a human king. And we have God, the real God, right? Indirectly referenced as blessing this king in verse 2. So it's not God talking, and he's not talking about God. He told us who he was talking about, the king. And now he's telling us God has blessed that king. Okay, now let's bring back up verse 8 from Hebrews 1. So it's very clear, I believe, from that alone, verses 1 and 2, and I reviewed the whole psalm. I just didn't focus on verse 2 as much in my video clip yesterday, so I want to go over that a little. It's very clear Psalm 45 is not addressing God. God has blessed the one he's addressing, and God is not singing the song. No, it's a human writer, and he's referring to God indirectly as blessing the one he's writing about. So again, remember, we have deceptive liars or people who are too gone. We have to be sure we do what we can to try to help if people are just really confused. Sometimes that happens. Most of the time, though, these people are gone. They don't care. If they cared, this is not difficult to solve. Verses 10, 11, and 12. Okay, so that was verses 8 and 9, right? I didn't really get into, right? This is the part from verse 9. Therefore, God, your God. See the little 3 dots here? So I'm just quoting the parts that are relevant that we often discuss, and then showing you the context of Psalm 45, from which verses 8 and 9 are quoted, to show it's not God talking, and he's not even talking about God, which we already know. But that's not the issue here. The issue here is who is saying these words right there? Well, we know. We just read it. The one writing the song about the king, who's clearly differentiated from God, who has blessed the king. Verses 10, 11, and 12. Okay, these come up the most because this is where Sam and God Logic and others collapse. This is where they go insane and think the Father again is talking. They think he's talking this whole time, I guess, right? They often say that or imply it. And certainly here, right? So we only have had the Father clearly talking in verse 5. Then we had the psalmist in verse 6. Then we had the psalmist again, Psalm 104, in verse 7. And then we had the songwriter from Psalm 45 in verses 8 and 9. Okay, so here we have the quotation from Psalm 102. Everybody knows, and even I think now they realize, because I haven't heard them saying it anymore. And now they're saying, okay, the original psalm, like everybody already knew unless you were a retard. And I'm not kidding. This is beyond acceptable. We have Sam clearly saying it's addressed to God before he realized, no, it's not addressed to God. So they're finally realizing, it seems, this Psalm 102 is not God talking. Right? That's blasphemy if you look just at the opening in terms of who's really talking. So it's a lowly human songwriter again. And that's who's talking, right? So it's a human. Now they say, no, it's the Father here, right? But why? There's nothing in verse 8 or 9 that's the Father talking. There's nothing in verse 7. There's nothing in verse 6. It depends on the quotation is what tells you who's talking, unless it's changed, right? I don't see any way you could say there's a difference when there is no difference. They're literally introducing a series of quotations, as we've been telling you guys for years. It's unbelievable. You know how much time these people have wasted? You know, it's probably their little demonic game, right? They don't care, everyone, or they're so gone and stupid. I mean, We got to be careful here. There's something not right with their processing of facts, right? So we have to start considering, are they being blinded? Is this a lost cause, right? I mean, just how clear does this have to be to everybody? Verse 5, Father talking. Verse 6, he's not talking. Verse 7, he's not talking. Verse 8, 9, he's not talking. Verses 10 through 11 are the words of a human psalmist from Psalm 102. There is nothing in the words quoted or in the context of the quotation that suggests in any way that we're somehow supposed to see the Father talking here. And we already know, as we just showed, he hasn't been talking for several verses in the quotations. Just verse 5. That's it. Then in verse 13, right, he says, to which of the angels did he ever say, sit at my right hand? That's the Father again from Psalm 110:1. He's talking about the Lord, as I discussed yesterday and often do. This is God talking to the Lord. That fits here, just like verse 5. You are my son, I today have become your father. I will be a father to you, you'll be a son to me. Verse 5. Well, that's God. That's the Father talking, so it makes perfect sense. The other quotations, verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, verse 9, verse 10, verse 11, verse 12, none of those were the Father talking in any of them. They were all very clearly not the Father talking, right? It's so obvious. Okay, so we get to verse 13. So he's making another quotation. This time he's quoting from Psalm 110:1. And it's the Father talking, who's distinct from the very Lord he's talking about here. So there's a good reason the Father's talking again in verse 13, isn't there? Because he's saying the exact same things that he said in the original quotation. There's no change. The only change there is what's really changed from the Hebrew to the Greek in verses 10 through 12, but it doesn't change who's talking in those Psalms, Greek or Hebrew. So again, this isn't really about who is being addressed. It's about who's talking. And to some extent that overlaps as we've been showing, but the main point we're discussing here is, why are these guys saying the Father is talking in Hebrews chapter 1, except for verses 5 and 13, where he actually is talking? There is no evidence, no grammatical or contextual, either from the source or in the context of the quotation, that suggests that at all. And the quotations themselves in the form they're made show there is no change, that the quotation is what he's using them to say. So in verse 5, it's the Father. In verse 13, it's the Father, but not verse 6, not verse 7, not verse 8, not verse 9, not verse 10, not verse 11, and not verse 12. You guys are liars. You're going to have to repent. This is going to be bad. There's going to be punishment here for this blasphemy, promoting false doctrine. You were warned. Not many of you should be teachers, but you all ignored the warning. And you got up here in your stupid little outfits and your pig fatness and lied about the God of the Bible. You lied about the Bible for yourselves. You're not doing this for God. You're not doing this to promote truth. You're doing this to promote a fake God, lies, and divide people by telling those who do teach the truth, saying to those about those who do teach the truth, like me and I just did, we're wrong. When your interpretation is so gone, it's another type of wrong, right? So there is no evidence for what you guys are talking about at all, and all the evidence shows you're gone. Now, look one more time. One other verse that God Logic ran from in his commentary on Hebrews 1, we stopped yesterday and in my 6-hour video after he ran away from verse 13, but that's because he didn't even show verse 14, I don't think, and if he did, he ran away from that too. There's another verse beyond the other verse 13 he ran from, right? This guy was crazy. He absolutely destroyed verse 3, ran from half of it, ran from verse 4, ran from verse 5, ran from verse 6, ran from verse 7. He finally got to verse 8. He probably felt pretty good with his translation of that there, right? But now it's collapsed. And then, of course, he maintained the lie that Sam's responsible for in large part, that the Father's praying to the Son in Hebrews 1:10. Gone. Look at verse 14. Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? All angels are ministering spirits. Fat Sam and God Logic and all you other pagans who lie about the God of the Bible, the angels of the Bible and the Son, Messiah of the Bible. So, we already know, as we read from verse 7, he makes his angels spirits, his servants flames of fire. There is no way you can exclude the angel of the Lord from either one of those. He's one of his angels, and he's a flame of fire. And what is more, in this very same context and chapter, verse 14 shows all of those angels that are flames of fire that he just referenced, and he's talking about contrasting with the Son since his resurrection, are ministering spirits sent to serve. All of them, you understand? They're all made spirits, all flames of fire. It's not just one, Sam. Okay? There's no singular reference here. Did you see that in verse 7? No. He makes his angels spirits, flames of fire. That sounds like all of them. Yeah, just like Acts 7, just like Zechariah 1. It's not one. And right here, they're all ministering spirits sent to serve. Okay, so we know that question I asked, and that is often, almost always ignored. If Trinitarians believe Jesus is the angel of the Lord, the flame of fire who appeared throughout the Old Testament, why is the author of Hebrews contrasting the Son with all of those angels and asking, well, when did he ever say this to any of those angels? The only explanation you're going to be able to come up with is he said it to him as a man. That includes verse 8, verse 9, verse 10, verse 11, verse 12, verse 6. Exactly. That's exactly what he's doing. So see, you're not too far, but you do believe in Trinity. So unfortunately, that is too far. And it makes you guys look stupid by interpreting texts that are really easy to read. You've destroyed our ability as a society to have a coherent understanding because all these terrible translations, commentaries, and just bad videos. Sam, now God Logic, right? I mean, you guys are responsible for distorting some of the simplest chapters of the Bible. John 1, Hebrews 1, and everything connected with them. You guys have the Father praying to the Son in Hebrews 1. He's not even talking to him except verses 5 and 13. You want to show me a prayer in those? Exactly, because he's not praying to him in those. He's raising him from the dead, and he's referring to him as his Lord, David's Lord, who's going to sit at his right hand, not as Yahweh. So, the only times you have him speaking in Hebrews 1 disproves your view, and the entire chapter, of course, proves ours. That's why God Logic avoided pretty much all of it, right? We're still finding verses like verse 14 that he ran from. So hopefully you guys can explain to us just how the Father's talking in verses 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, when that's not who's talking. And the only times the Father is talking, verses 5 and 13, are when he's actually talking in the context from which the quotation is from.